All right, well, today we're going to talk about fungi and wrap up this chapter on these early kingdoms. To begin with, we'll talk about the characteristics that all fungus have in common. First of all, they are eukaryotic organisms. This is similar to the protists, the plants, and the animals. One thing that they do have in common that kind of separates them from the other kingdoms, though, is that they're all decomposers. There are a couple of exceptions, some parasites in there, but for the most part, fungi get their food from decaying organic matter. They all reproduce by forming spores. This is one thing that the fungus-like protists had in common with this kingdom. And we'll talk more in class tomorrow or the next day about what exactly a spore is. But for right now, you just need to know that it is a reproductive cell of a fungus. The body of the fungus is made up of these thread-like tubes called hyphae, and you may have noticed this before looking at a mushroom real closely or another fungus. The body looks like a densely packed bundle of thread, and those threads are called hyphae. And finally, we're going to classify these into 4 or 5 phyla here based on the structures in which they form their spores. Here's a little picture of a puffball mushroom releasing spores when it reproduces, and you can see there's literally millions upon millions of single-celled spores that are released by each fungus whenever they reproduce. Our first group is going to be the phylum Zygomycota. The common name for this phylum is zygote fungi, and they form their spores in these round little spheres on the tip of these little stalks, these upright hyphae. Those spore cases are called sporangia. A good example species, one that you're probably familiar with, is black bread mold. You've probably seen that before. Here's a picture zoomed in on a piece of bread getting covered in black mold. Here's more of a cartoon version of the life cycle of sporangia. You can see that the hyphae form these tall stalks when they get ready to reproduce, and the spore cases look like little spheres on the top of those stalks. That's where the spores form. Once a spore is released, if it lands in a spot with food and water, it'll grow into another fungus. Next group is the phylum Ascomycota. Common name here is the sac fungi. They reproduce, or they form their spores in sacs called asci. Many of these are parasites, including Dutch elm disease and apple scab. But on the flip side of that, many of these are important food sources for people, including morels, truffles, and yeast. If you've ever gone mushroom hunting in Nebraska, you are actually not looking for mushrooms. You are looking for a fungus called a morel. Belongs to a different phylum than the phylum that mushrooms belong to. Next, we have the phylum Basidiomycota. Common name here is club fungi. Spores are formed in club-shaped structures called basidia. These are your mushrooms. So these are very economically important. Mushrooms, of course, are a widely consumed food source all over the world. And also on the flip side of that, a couple of these are disease-causing fungi, including rusts and smuts, which damage a lot of crops grown in the United States. Here we see some mushrooms being grown for consumption. They are grown in a big pile of manure. So if you buy fresh mushrooms, I would give you this advice: wash them thoroughly. Finally, we have the phylum Deuteromycota. The common name here is imperfect fungi. This includes fungi in which spore formation has not been directly observed, or spore formation varies. Sometimes certain parts of the fungus produce spores, other times other parts of the fungus produce spores. Example species here, one of the most famous fungi ever is Penicillium. This is the fungus that produces penicillin, the very first antibiotic discovered by people. Members of this phylum can also be kind of a pain. One member causes ringworm, another one causes athlete's foot. So we have some parasites here. There's a picture of the fungus Penicillium growing on an orange in a similar fashion to the way that it was first discovered. Last group we're going to talk about here are the lichens. Lichens are actually formed by a symbiosis between a fungus and an alga, which is singular for algae. The algae actually lives inside the cells of the fungus, and the algae does photosynthesis, producing enough food for itself, but also a surplus of glucose, which the fungus then uses for its own food source, and in return, the algae gets a safe place to live where it's protected. There's a picture of a green lichen growing on straw. A lot of times lichens are found on rocks and on the trunks of trees. All right, to wrap things up today, I'm going to have you create a study table similar to the ones that you used for the protists. We're going to include 5 phyla of fungi on this table. You're going to use the column headings phylum, common name, characteristics or special characteristics, and then example species. In the case of the lichens, lichens will be the phylum name, they will also be the common name, and they will also be the example species. So you'll have just the word lichen. We're just going to use the common name across the board there. Use lichen for phylum, common name, and example species. All right, holler if you have questions, and good luck.